The guests finished the sentence, and Dr. Phil immediately turned to production. Stop the cameras. The words cut through the studio like a knife. No one moved. The audience, used to dramatic moments, had never seen him do this. Not like this. His hand was still raised, frozen in the air as if holding back an invisible force. The woman in the chair across from him stared at her hands, trembling. On the small table between them sat a folded piece of paper, a letter she'd been carrying for 17 years. And in that letter was a truth so devastating, it had just rewritten everything her family believed about who she was. This wasn't supposed to happen, not on camera, not in front of 200 people. But Dr. Phil had learned long ago that some moments don't wait for permission. 3 weeks earlier, the Dr. Phil show received an email. It was short, almost clinical in tone. My name is Claire. I've been living a lie for nearly 2 decades. My family doesn't know who I really am. I need help before it destroys us all. The production team had seen thousands of these messages. Most were cries for attention. Some were genuine pleas. And a few, just a few, were something else entirely. This one felt different. There was no drama in the words, no emotional manipulation, just a flat, terrifying honesty. Dr. Phil read it twice. Then he called the senior producer into his office. "Get her on the phone," he said. "Today." Claire answered on the second ring. Her voice was steady, almost detached, like she'd rehearsed this conversation 100 times in her head. She explained that she was 38 years old, married for 15 years, mother of 2 teenage daughters. On the surface, she was the picture of suburban normalcy, PTA meetings, book clubs, family dinners every Sunday. But underneath, she'd been carrying a secret so heavy, it had begun to consume her from the inside out. "I wasn't born Claire," she said quietly. "That's not my real name. It's not even close." Dr. Phil leaned back in his chair, listening. He'd heard confessions before. Affairs, addictions, hidden debts. But something in her tone told him this was different. This wasn't about shame. It was about survival. She told him that when she was 19, she'd walked away from her entire life, changed her name, moved across the country, and reinvented herself completely. No one in her current life, not her husband, not her children, not her closest friends, knew anything about who she'd been before. And for 17 years, it had worked. Until now. "Why now?" Dr. Phil asked. "Because my daughter just got accepted to college," Claire said, her voice cracking for the first time. "And it's the same town where I grew up, the same town I ran from." Dr. Phil paused. He could hear the weight of those words, the years of fear compressed into a single unavoidable collision. "And you think someone's going to recognize you?" "I know they will," she whispered. "And when they do, my family will find out I've been lying to them their entire lives." Dr. Phil made a decision in that moment. This wasn't just another show. This was a woman standing on the edge of losing everything. And she needed more than advice. She needed a lifeline. He told her to come to the studio alone. No family, not yet. They needed to understand the full story first. What she was running from, why she'd erased herself, and what the cost of the truth would be. Claire agreed. She booked a flight for the following week, telling her husband she was visiting an old college friend. The day she arrived at the studio, Dr. Phil met with her privately before taping. They sat in a small room off the main stage, just the two of them. She handed him the letter, the one she'd written to her daughters years ago, a confession she'd never been able to send. He read it in silence, and when he finished, he looked up at her with something she hadn't expected. Not judgment, but recognition. "You were protecting yourself," he said quietly. She nodded, tears finally breaking through. "I didn't know what else to do." What Dr. Phil learned in that room was this. When Claire was 19, she'd been involved in something terrible. Not a crime, not an affair, but a family tragedy so painful that staying meant living in the shadow of it forever. Her younger brother had died in an accident she'd been present for, an accident that her parents, in their grief, had blamed her for. Not explicitly, not in words, but in the silence that followed, in the way they looked at her, in the way the whole town seemed to hold her responsible for a loss no one could make sense of. So she left. And when she left, she didn't just move, she disappeared. New name, new social security number, new history. She became someone else because being herself had become unbearable.
"But you built a life," Dr. Phil said. "A good life. A family who loves you. A family who loves someone who doesn't exist." She corrected. "They love Claire, but Claire is a ghost." Subscribe and leave a comment because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Dr. Phil brought her onto the stage that afternoon. The audience didn't know what they were about to witness. To them, this looked like any other taping. Lights, cameras, the familiar set. Claire sat down in the chair across from him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Dr. Phil started with the basics, the setup, the context. He asked her about her life now, her daughters, her marriage. She answered carefully, her voice controlled, like she was walking on glass. And then he asked a question that changed everything. "Claire, when did you stop being yourself?" She looked at him, and for a moment it seemed like she might not answer. The studio was silent. Even the cameras felt like they were holding their breath. And then, in a voice so quiet the microphones barely caught it, she said, "When I was 19, the day my brother died, that's the day I stopped existing." Dr. Phil leaned forward. "And who have you been since then?" Her hands started to shake. She looked down at the letter on the table, the one she'd been carrying for 17 years, and then back up at him. And that's when she said it. "I was never who they thought I was." The words landed like a shockwave. The audience didn't gasp, they froze, because the way she said it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a confession designed for television. It was the truth, raw and unfiltered, and it was terrifying in its simplicity. Dr. Phil paused mid-sentence. The studio went completely silent. He didn't move, he didn't speak, he just looked at her. And in that look was something the audience had rarely seen from him. Genuine shock. Not at what she'd done, but at the depth of the pain it took to do it. This wasn't a woman who'd made a mistake. This was a woman who survived the only way she knew how. And then he did something no one expected. He raised his hand toward the cameras and said, "Stop the tape." The audience stirred. A few people looked at each other, confused. The cameras kept rolling for a moment, uncertain, until Dr. Phil stood up and walked toward the production booth at the edge of the stage. "I said, stop," he repeated, this time louder. "Turn them off now." One by one, the red recording lights blinked out. The studio, which moments before had been a carefully controlled environment, suddenly felt raw and exposed. Dr. Phil turned back to Claire, who was staring at him with wide, frightened eyes. "This isn't for them," he said, gesturing to the audience, to the cameras, to the apparatus of the show itself. "This is for you." He walked back to his chair and sat down, leaning forward so that only she could hear him clearly. The audience was still there, but they weren't the audience anymore. They were just witnesses. And what happened next wasn't part of the show. It was something else entirely. Dr. Phil asked for the questions he hadn't asked on camera, the ones that mattered. Not what happened, but how she'd survived it. Not why she ran, but how she managed to keep running for 17 years. And she told him. She told him about the nightmares, the panic attacks, the constant fear that one day someone would recognize her and the carefully constructed life she'd built would collapse. She told him about the guilt, not for leaving, but for staying gone, for building a family on a foundation of erasure. "They love you," Dr. Phil said, "not the ghost, you, the person sitting here right now. But they don't know who that is," she whispered. "Then it's time to let them meet her." Off camera, Dr. Phil made a choice no producer expected.
He told Claire that they weren't going to air this segment. Not like this, not as spectacle. Instead, he was going to help her tell her family on her terms, in her time, with the support she needed. He brought in his team, his therapists, his counselors, and over the next 2 hours they worked with her to create a plan, a way forward that didn't involve running anymore. But before they finished, Dr. Phil did one more thing. He picked up the letter from the table, the one she'd written to her daughters, and he read it aloud, not for the cameras, not for the audience, but for her, so she could hear, maybe for the first time, that the words she'd been too afraid to say out loud were not the end of her story. They were the beginning of a new one. When he finished reading, he set the letter back down and looked at her. "You've been carrying this alone for 17 years. You don't have to carry it anymore." She broke, not quietly, not gracefully, but fully.
Phil, who had spent decades helping people navigate their darkest moments, simply sat with her while she did. But what happened next is something no one in the room or watching at home saw coming. 2 weeks later, Claire came back to the studio. This time, she wasn't alone. Her husband sat beside her. Her daughters sat in the front row of the audience. And in her hand, she held a different letter, one she'd written after that first taping, one she finally had the courage to send. Dr. Phil didn't introduce her as a guest this time. He introduced her as someone who had done the hardest thing a person can do. She told the truth. Her husband spoke first. He was angry, yes, hurt, yes, but more than that, he was confused. "I don't understand why you thought you had to hide," he said. "I don't understand why you thought I wouldn't love you if I knew." Claire looked at him, tears streaming down her face. "Because I didn't love me," she said, "and I couldn't imagine how anyone else could." Her daughters didn't say much. They were still processing, still trying to reconcile the mother they'd known with the woman sitting in front of them. But one of them, the older one, reached out and took her hand, and that was enough. Dr. Phil let them talk. He didn't interrupt, didn't guide, didn't perform. He just gave them space to be human, to be messy, to be real. And when it was over, he turned to the audience and said something he rarely said. "This is why we do this show. Not for the ratings, not for the drama, but for moments like this, when someone who's been lost finally finds their way home." The audience stood, not because they were told to, but because they couldn't help it. And as Claire and her family embraced on stage, Dr. Phil stepped back, letting them have that moment. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Months later, Dr. Phil received a letter. It was from Claire. She told him that her daughter had started college in the town where she'd grown up. And yes, someone had recognized her. An old teacher, a family friend. But instead of the disaster she'd imagined, it had been something else entirely. It had been closure, a chance to say the things she'd never been able to say, to apologize, to explain, to finally, after all these years, be seen. She thanked him, not for the show, not for the cameras, but for stopping them, for seeing her not as content, but as a person who needed help. And she ended the letter with a single line that Dr. Phil kept on his desk for years afterward. "You didn't save my life, but you helped me remember that it was worth saving." Dr. Phil read that letter more than once, and every time he did, he was reminded of why he did this work. Not for the spectacle, not for the audience, but for the people who walked onto his stage carrying burdens they didn't know how to put down. People like Claire, who'd spent years believing that the truth would destroy them, only to discover that it was the thing that finally set them free. The letter she'd carried for 17 years, the one she'd been too afraid to send, was eventually given to her daughters. They read it together as a family. And though it didn't erase the pain, it helped them understand it. It helped them see their mother not as a liar, but as someone who'd done what she thought she had to do to survive. In the end,
That's what Dr. Phil had given her. Not answers, but permission. Permission to stop running. Permission to be imperfect. Permission to be human. And that, more than any advice or intervention, was what changed everything. The studio audience that day, the ones who'd witnessed the moment Dr. Phil stopped the cameras, never forgot it. Many of them later said it was the most powerful thing they'd ever seen on television, precisely because it wasn't television anymore. It was real life, unscripted and unrehearsed, happening right in front of them. One audience member, a woman named Patricia, wrote to Dr. Phil afterward. She said that she'd been carrying her own secret for years, and watching Claire find the courage to tell hers had given her the strength to do the same. You showed me that the truth doesn't have to destroy you. Sometimes it's the only thing that can save you, she wrote. Dr. Phil kept that letter too, because that's what he'd learned over decades of doing this work. One person's courage could ripple outward in ways no one could predict. Claire's story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who'd ever felt trapped by their past, everyone who'd ever believed that the truth would cost them everything.